So, Dana, you're born and raised in Fairbanks. What was it like growing up here?
Well, it was a much smaller place. The population of Alaska as a whole has quadrupled since I was born and doubled since I entered college. So it's a remarkable change. Only a statistician would know that right off, right? So, you know, in my early years, we had what I would call a military economy. That's what my father used to call it. Ironically, I think we may be headed back into that now.
Yeah.
That's my own take. It's a kind of a low, slow economy. Nothing like the pipeline era, right? When things were fast-paced and exciting, and sometimes too exciting, I guess I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But small town, you know, quality schools, a good university, you know, attracted good people. So,
was there any question, I mean, were your parents academically oriented? Was there any question that you'd go on to college at all?
so there was no question about whether I was going to college or not. I was going to college. But neither of my parents had gone to college, and I don't believe any of my grandparents or great-grandparents went to college. So,
Wow.
so my brother and I and my sister were the first generation. So, and all three of us earned degrees. So,
Isn't that remarkable? Why UAF?
so a certain irony there. I had actually been accepted to go outside to school, Colorado. Was seriously planning on that, and my mother died rather suddenly in my senior year, and her and my father had been divorced just short of a year before that. So my brother and I ended up dealing with probate, and so I stayed and went to college at UAF. I may have stayed anyway, you know, some uncertainty there, but that life event very clearly had an impact on choices, and so I went to UAF, and I got a very good education at UAF. In fact, I guess I would say I would not be here today if it weren't for my father and mother's insistence on me going to college, first of all, and then on two biology faculty members convincing me to go on to graduate school.
Oh, interesting. Who were they?
Well, I'll tell you the story. I was a senior in biology. Some folks in here were with me at that time in the room here today, which is just a wonderful experience to see that. But I took a day off. I missed a day of class, which was unusual. I was very good at attending class, and I did that to take the plumber's apprenticeship test. You know, the next day, two faculty members, Steve McLean and a geneticist named Shoemaker, I can't remember his first name, said, "You missed class. What's happening?" You know, and I told them what I was doing. They said, "Oh, you can't do that. You need to go to graduate school." And I said, you know, I looked at the biologist register with Fish and Game and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Used to have to register to get on jobs lists back then. There were about 250 people on the register for those jobs, and many of those folks had masters and doctorates, and I was just finishing a baccalaureate, and I said, doesn't seem like a great path there in terms of employment, and so I was looking at the plumber's apprenticeship. So anyway, they talked me into taking statistics as an elective in my senior year. And all of my friends thought I was crazy because nobody took that unless you had to take that. And I just loved it. And so that set my future path.
So I was going to ask what drew you to statistics. I'm trying to think which professor I was talking to who really kind of expressed the regret that he wasn't more thoroughly grounded in statistics when he studied biology. He's a professor of biology here. Can't remember who I was talking to at the time. So when you were early on, statistics had become, or was it developing into the very important key in the biological sciences that it occupies today?
It certainly did in some fields. It started off early in agriculture, as you might guess, trying to make crops more productive. That's an early history of statistics. Some areas of medicine as well, but those two primary areas. And I don't really think it caught on in other areas very well until the technology, the computer equipment and software programming became readily available, because it was rather tedious work. You know, back when you had to use
Slide rules and...
Well, yeah, not so much slide rules, but we used, what do they call them, 16-key calculators, things like that. So, yeah, things were very different.
So you returned to the University of Alaska Fairbanks as a professor. What was there, had it changed much in the interim period, and what was the university and your department like when you first started out?
Well, it was a significant change for me because I was in a biology department as an undergraduate, and I came back and entered a math, statistics, and at that time, computer science department. And so the kind of people and their interests that I was around at those two different stages in my life, very different, right? So the university at that time, you know, I like to reflect on this. UAF had I shouldn't say UAF, the state of Alaska public education had the second highest salaries for faculty in the nation at that time. We were second only to, and I can't remember if it was Massachusetts or Connecticut. And because of that, we drew very good faculty. We had amazing benefits packages, some of the top 2 or 3% in the nation. And between those, we drew excellent faculty. We still do today, but last time I checked, we were something like 37th in faculty salaries, you know, compared to what we were back then. So things really did change.
This is the early 80s, right?
81 I started.
Yeah.
August 81, yeah. So quite a shift in the expectations from those times. Again, we still attract great faculty, but the conditions are very different now.
Of course, we're talking to you today as a leader, but I'm wondering, you taught for so many years and really were acknowledged as a great teacher. I've talked to a number of people informally who just said you were terrific. So I'm wondering, as an administrator, was there value being in the trenches? Because some of our recent leaders come from other occupations, other disciplines. Was there a value to coming up through that way, and was there a value being a student here previously?
The student role, I'm not so sure, but certainly you know, following the tenure track and promotion and tenure process, serving on the faculty senate, you know, those kinds of things, certainly I would say helped with my credibility to some degree in dealing with faculty and staff across the institution. The various roles I held helped me get to know the institution very well. Department chair and accreditation work in particular, you get to know areas of the institution much more broadly than sort of the average faculty member. And those served me well in you know, establishing my knowledge base. That can be a hindrance as well too, right? Because you establish certain thoughts or feelings about certain areas of the university which, with the changing of time, may no longer be true. And so you have to constantly reflect and assess whether your knowledge is current or not.
Mm-hmm. So. Was there an aha moment where you said, you know what, maybe I'd be a good leader, or this is something I seem to do well, and this is what I'd like to pursue? Was there any moment for you, Dana, where you said, yeah, I'd like administration?
I would say I didn't pursue it purposefully. I found myself thrown into it by asking too many questions.
That'll teach you.
Yeah. So one of the things that you learn in life, I suppose, is if you ask about something or question something, you're often then shackled with the responsibility of fixing the thing that you've pointed out or questioned. And so I would say that happened to me more often than not, and I never learned that lesson well enough to stop doing it. So others seem to have picked that up. So I suffered from that.
You talked about a couple of professors who were instrumental in leading you into an academic career. Were there administrators that you worked with or you viewed and you said, you know, that's a good style, that kind of, I'd like to model how I lead on that? Or was it just something you grew into, as you say?
There were role models, both classroom role models. I still reflect on some of those, both from UAF and from Oregon State University that helped shape the way I taught. But on the administrative side, certainly the first probably was the chair of the Department of Statistics at Oregon State University. He eventually became a dean there. So he was maybe the first that I really noticed in that regard. But I would say Paul Reichert and Susan Henricks, certainly role models with regard to leadership for me. I've watched all of the UAF chancellors, with the exception of Cutler. I was in graduate school when Cutler was chancellor, but I knew and worked with all of the others, starting with Pat O'Rourke, 1981. So I watched their styles. I watched the way that, you know, some of them challenged the university to sort of reach beyond itself, to excel, and some that just were kind of caretakers. So I certainly observed that. I think the university has been extremely well served by two very long provosts, Paul Reichert and Susan Henricks, and I think that that sense of stability for the institution that longevity provides, often underrated or underappreciated, but I think both of them made a significant difference in shaping this institution.
Well, I'd like you to reflect both from your experience as a student and as an administrator as we move through here, but of course, over time, that I've been associated with the university, and maybe always it was thus, but there are cycles in funding, and there are lean years and fatter years, as it were. Any reflection about that cycle and how one manages or how one accommodates the mission when resources are scarce?
You're right. There certainly are cycles. I've seen, you know, in almost 35 years, I've certainly seen the ups and downs. One of the most significant was 86, 87, and the years that followed that are still to this day referred to as the desert years, very commonly among faculty and staff. We did some things wrong that we've learned lessons that we're behaving a bit differently this time. I'm proud of that. There were opportunities when money was forthcoming that leadership didn't step up sufficiently and try to pay off debt or deal with some things that we can and should have dealt with then. So there were missed opportunities along the way as well. And again, we've learned some lessons from some of those mistakes. But it is, you know, it's part of Alaska's history to have this cycle of ups and downs, the boom and bust, and the university follows it. Because of that, I think the university and K-12 education as well would benefit from forward funding. You know, have a 2-year funding cycle, things like that, to help with the stability. We've never achieved that, but I think that would have great value if we ever do get to a high point in the fiscal climate once again.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that distinguishes this university, I think, in many ways, is its non-traditional students. Many people come into the university system after they have some practical experience. And so it's a different student body a little bit. Would you reflect on that? And then the other side of the coin is the challenge of attracting more of our high school, having better high school graduates prepare for university, and then I'm attracting them here. So I'm kind of giving a two-pronged approach to this recruitment of students and student body.
Okay, given my age, you may have to remind me of the second part, but I'll move forward. UAF and Alaska generally has an older population of students coming to the university. And I think that a lot of that is reflective of two sources. One is, as you've noted, Alaska has one of the lowest college going rates in the nation. We're usually in the bottom three, and discouraging. That needs to change to help the economy of Alaska and to help Alaska move forward in many different respects. And so what happens is high school graduates will go out, find work, often, at least historically, relatively high-paying work, but then they decide after a few years, that's not going to play out long-term for them, and so they come back to college, right? Or they come to college for the first time, often with families, children, mortgage payments, all that life has to offer. The other part of that that often gets overlooked is Alaska has a highly transient population. And so we have folks that have graduated high school outside, found a high-paying job in Alaska, or tried college outside, weren't excited about it or motivated at the time, which happens to a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds. And then after a few years of work and arriving in Alaska, they decide that college is for them as well. And so those two populations are very commonly what come to us. So the third, of course, is the traditional student that comes directly out of high school, graduates, comes to the university, and is highly motivated. And so the university has this mix of students. A greater proportion of the older students with families than we would have for the traditional undergraduate. The challenge then is meeting both of those groups of students' needs, right? Having active student programming for the traditional student, the sort of usual things that you would have, and then the service and support for the let's say non-traditional or older students with families. Right now, I think we still do a better job for traditional students than we do for non-traditional. UAF is doing reasonably well in offering online courses and online programs, and that collection is increasing, and that's serving those students, giving them more flexibility in their lives. But we're still not doing quite enough, I don't think, on evening and weekend courses to meet those students' needs, and we could be doing more there. We offer relatively little programming for non-traditional students, and again, we could be doing more in that regard. So, there's still lessons to be learned.
Oh, I'm sure.
I'll pick on the faculty a little bit. Faculty generally like to teach between 10 and 2, and that doesn't serve the non-traditional student extremely well.
Isn't that what grad students are for?
There you go. And adjuncts, right?
And adjuncts,
torture
exactly.
the adjuncts.
Well, and then I wonder, too, another aspect about our state is its vast extent and the satellite campuses that are, and again, many of these communities, it offers those who are ready to occupy the university an opportunity to engage within their familiar cultural and living situation. But it puts some challenges, I think, in sending either faculty out there or developing, as you point out, distance education. What are the challenges in serving our more rural student population in some of these remote sites?
Thank you for that opportunity. There's lots to discuss there. Distance education for rural Alaska is still challenged by limited bandwidth. And that varies across the various locations in the state. Some are better prepared than others, and that I think we're at the brink over the next 5 to 10 years, certainly, of that changing significantly. There's a lot happening in that regard, so I think we will see a significant shift in that. I often say public institutions should always be examined in 3 areas: quality, access, and efficiency. And I've got sort of 2 mindsets on this that are disparate, and I struggle to get them to agree. All right, so I'll sort of hit that conundrum that I face internally. I often say that the University of Alaska system as a whole has prioritized access over either of the other 2 elements, quality or efficiency. So that's on the one hand, right? So we have, if you look across the state, I think it's 15 campuses. Wyoming effectively has 1, right? So there's a statement about access versus efficiency there. On the other hand, we had, I believe, all but 1 or 2 of those community campuses before Alaska had oil. And so it's been a priority for a very long time, and should be. Access to higher education, should be a priority for the state. I'm not convinced that the state is still spending on rural education in particular in proportion to the population that is rural. We often say it's too expensive to deliver higher education at the rural communities, but I believe that something like, and again, don't quote me, but something like 12% of the population is truly rural, right, off of the road system entirely or the ferry system. And yet I don't believe we're quite spending that percentage for higher education access of the university's budget. So there's a variety of different perspectives on that I struggle with, right? I would like, I've often felt like we should focus more on the quality element of the university system and often lean that direction as an academic, but access has extreme value as well in a state as geographically dispersed as ours. So it's a difficult thing for me to resolve internally.
Well, and you touch on something, there's a couple of breakout opportunities with that last thing, but I want to just acknowledge that with the title University of Alaska, there's the implied responsibility by lawmakers to fund the university, but that funding is often at risk. It's cut, and we've seen a sort of a steady decline over the last half dozen years or so. Do you have any insight, since you were born and raised in the state, you were a student here, how we get lawmakers to value higher education and get a sense of that obligation to kind of fund the future, if you will?
That's difficult. I've had many of those conversations. In fact, many of our legislators are alumni, earned their degrees with us. And we have those conversations with them. Do you value your degree?
I bet you do, yeah.
Has it benefited you in any way or benefited the state in any way? So those are, clear questions and conversations that we have. I think one of the curious things for me, if I look back at 86, 87, watched Governor Sheffield on the steps of the Rasmussen Library, saying that the university was going to be reduced 25% of its general funds in a single year. That was appalling and created quite a change in the university that we still live with today. But the legislature and the governor at that time were almost apologetic, maybe not even almost, they were apologetic. They didn't want to have to cut the university, but they were really strapped on the fiscal side. The conversation today is different. There's almost an interest in further reducing the university, and I don't have a great sense of why that is. There is a disturbing, growing sense of anti-intellectualism across the planet to some degree, within the United States to some degree as well. I don't feel that same thing in Alaska generally, but it makes me wonder if there's some carryover in that direction. With the fall in oil prices from roughly $105 to $110 a barrel to its low point at 27 just a few years ago, and today it's about 42, clearly Alaska has a challenge fiscally that our legislature is having to deal with, and I don't envy them those difficult choices. But I see as, and it's my own bias being an academic, but I see higher education as a path forward out of those difficult economic times. The university is an economic engine in a variety of ways, both in the educational sense, but also in externally funded research. And so it provides a path forward during these difficult times that I don't think is fully appreciated by the legislature.
Do we have to do a better marketing job? I think it was Doug Goering who was mentioning that he grew up and when the university in the 60s went through this growth, buildings were going up and whatnot. It was before the oil money hit. So at some point, lawmakers and maybe a lot of this was new federal dollars that were coming in to fund research and whatnot. But it seemed at one point, everybody got it. If you wanted to prepare young people and the state for the future, you invested in education.
Right.
Yeah. It's something. Well, that leads to the other side of the coin, if you will. As President Johnson just observed, with a cut that was introduced by state lawmakers, looking at tuition again. And it's a fine balancing act. We say what a bargain it is for students at the tuition rate right now, but as you point out, we have to attract students up here, and oftentimes one of the key factors that makes this an attractive campus is a relatively modest tuition. Is there a fine line, a razor's edge you have to walk as an administrator to get that, where we attract students and yet we also draw more income from them?
So tuition elasticity is always a challenge. What will what will potential students or students, what are they willing to pay? So it's an area of common debate. Let me say that. So just for some perspective, our UAF's baccalaureate tuition is about 19% below the Western state average. All right. So certainly on the baccalaureate side, there's a lot of room there. The other side of it is community college tuition in the state of Alaska is exactly the same. And we're almost double the community college tuition of the Western states. And so we're a deal on one hand on the baccalaureate side, and we're far too expensive on the community college certificate and applied associate in particular side. One of the difficulties of the marriage between the community colleges and the universities is we didn't separate that tuition at the beginning, and we're living with it to this day. And that one is something that clearly needs attention, in my opinion. I've advocated for that, and it continues to be discussed, but we haven't found a solution yet. So that's a difficult. So coming back to the attracting students, Alaskan students are impacted by price. They tend to be debt averse, and the cost of tuition at the University of Alaska does attract some of those students, in particular in combination with the UA Scholars Program, the Alaska Performance Scholarship Program, and the Alaska Advantage Need-Based Program. Between those and our cost of tuition, we often end up having students stay in Alaska that otherwise might very well have left the state for higher education. Again, that's not our principal enemy with regard to enrollment. The college going rate is the principal issue in Alaska, the low college going rate in particular. So attracting students from out of state, I don't think we're advertising well enough our low baccalaureate tuition rate. And I think if that were well known, we might very well attract more students from out of state. We only get about between 10 and 14% at any given time from out of state. And I think we could be doing better, and that's a marketing issue.
Mm-hmm. The other piece of that statement, a few questions back that I want to break out, is the quality aspect of providing education.
Mm-hmm.
And that means attracting top-notch academics.
Yep.
And it's oftentimes very difficult to retain, let alone attract faculty when there's this question about funding, and it looks like things are a little dicey. And so talk to me a little bit about that side of bringing people new vision, new opportunities to engage with students. How do you do that?
At this time, during fiscal times, certainly faculty mobility is much greater than it used to be. So when I started, people tended to come and spend a career. There was some mobility then, and people left here to go to endowed chairs, things like that, had long careers here and extended their careers elsewhere. Faculty mobility is much greater now, so we often see faculty come for a shorter time, and sometimes in some fields we've become a training area. Somebody comes, establishes their first or second NSF grant, and then they get heavily recruited with high salaries and major labs at other institutions, and so we struggle with that to some degree, especially during very difficult fiscal times like we're in. So the best way to attract and retain people is to attract people initially that really have a niche. Their research or their teaching niche is connected to Alaska in some particular way, or similarly to the existing group of researchers here that they connect extremely well with. And that has served the institution well. So folks, when we try to get a real generalist in something that doesn't have that niche, those are the people we tend to lose more readily.
Mm. I often, having sat in on several attracting staff, let's say in broadcasting or whatnot, oftentimes the initial person is gung-ho, but the spouse is less than enthusiastic.
Yeah.
And I know that's always a challenge. But I think the university's done a great job in championing its geopolitical location as a research facility. And it seems to me that's one promising avenue to build on, too. Does that strike you the same way?
It does. The week of the Arctic here in May certainly highlighted that. But even Friday, I welcomed a large group from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, meeting with the International Arctic Research Center here over collaborative research. Surprisingly large group that was here, and very well-known international researchers. So we draw, in many ways, I often, one of my common statements is UAF is respected better globally than locally. There's a lot of truth in that.
And a lot of irony.
Rather disturbing, but true.
Well, touching on that international aspect, you had an opportunity to be a statistician in the Middle East, in Yemen, and do they have an approach to education that you observed that was it different? Are there elements we can learn from, or what was that perspective? Did that provide you any insight in how to approach education at all?
It certainly gave me insight into civil rights and not so much educational. I can speak to a little bit of it from Oman, but I was in Yemen 2 years. I worked on the National Survey of Agriculture there, and then I was 2 years in Oman working on fishery statistics. We set up sampling in 56 villages and created the first national estimates of the catch of about 200 species there. Certain irony there, Alaska is famous for its fisheries, but we really keep track of only 25 to 30 species commercially. So that's again the difference between the northern latitudes and the tropics. So one of the curious things there. So I didn't interact very much with education in Yemen, but in Oman I did a bit more. I talked at the university there. They purposefully set the university at some distance from the city, so it was difficult for students to march, for example, or to protest. They had a wall around the university with barbed wire on the top, which I thought was a curious thing. I had trouble knowing if that was keeping people in or keeping people out. And I would lecture in a room to a group of men, and was on camera to a group of women next door that was watching me on a screen. And so, a real difference there. In Oman in particular, higher education largely was for the wealthy and the well-connected. And it certainly made me appreciate the open access that U.S. citizens have to higher education. One of the very curious things is I worked for UAF on both those projects through U.S. Agency for International Development Contracts. Referred to it as the Middle East campus, right?
The satellite.
The satellite campus in each case. It was rather fun. Got all of my paychecks from UAF the entire time. So kind of entertaining in that regard. But in each case, part of the project was to identify up to 50 students to send to the United States for a higher education. And one of the ironies that I recall always makes me smile is in Yemen, we would have quite a few students that would back out the last day, all right? They were all signed up, ready to go, and it was out of fear, all right? And you got to enjoy the irony there. The fear of coming to the United States from Yemen, all right? And they were afraid of getting mugged. They were afraid of drunks and drug addicts, things that they had read about on the news that they had never encountered. Mugging is virtually unheard of. Alcohol and drugs are completely illegal, and virtually never saw any in either of the countries. So it was just, you know, the fear of those things, you know, was remarkable. And so, you know, my family, when Kay and I got ready to go to Yemen, they went, "Are you crazy?" You know, and of course, people share that view of Yemen to this day for a variety of reasons. But we had wonderful experiences in both countries. Great time to have been there, of course. Couldn't go back to Yemen today.
Well, you know, your mention about student protests, and I was thinking that barbed wire is probably faculty retention at work.
Yeah, there you go.
So we could kind of apply it here, maybe.
It's a perspective I hadn't thought of.
But I'm wondering about students. Of course, we've had Title IX. There's issues about bringing guns on campus. There's the perennial issue about alcohol and how it doesn't have a, should it be on campus or shouldn't? So, and we want to give kids or students of any age, I guess, an academically challenging. We want them to explore ideas, broaden their horizons, be provoked, if you will, and at the same time, we want to provide them a safe environment. And so, as an administrator, how do you handle that when you have these very serious issues on one hand, but also an opportunity for kids or anybody to have their horizons opened and new possibilities unveiled?
Well, I'm going to hit those one at a time.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I'll start with alcohol and guns on campus, and then Title IX. The overarching thing that I have to say is this is an institution of higher education. We have a role in helping to educate people in all of those areas, as well as the academic areas. Young people come to us, and we have a responsibility to share thoughts and ideas and to grow their understanding. Just as simple as that for me. So I'll start with alcohol. When I was a student at UAF, it was a dry campus. And the Wood Center was under construction, right, during that period. The pub did not exist. And I had many friends, and I would take part. We would drive into town, you know, buy liquor or go to a bar or whatever. The Howling Dog was there, the Midnight Mine was there, many other places that are familiar to this day. And then, of course, after having some drinks, we would drive back to campus. Right? Not the most safe thing to do. And I had friends that got in car wrecks and things and suffered, you know, those kinds of problems. Some that drank too much and suffered from exposure kinds of issues trying to get back to campus. So a whole variety of elements like that, right? So as a student, I testified before the Alcohol Beverage Control Board asking for the pub and asking for the campus not to be dry, right? Mostly out of, you know, my sense of safety for myself and my friends at that time and, you know, the driving aspect. And I think that was a good decision. I think, and so it shapes my view of alcohol on campus to this day. And I think there is an educational role there, and one that's appropriate for the university in that regard for the, you know, the young students, so to speak. Guns on campus, I'll move to that. When I was a student, I had a gun on campus. I lived in Moore Hall. We had to check it in to somebody that put it in locked storage. But we would check it out on the weekend and go hunting, you know, and that was a common thing. So, you know, we didn't have the attacks that, you know, like Virginia Tech and those back in those days. And so, and yet hunting was still most Alaskans, many Alaskans, hunted, and when they came to college, they expected to be able to continue that. And many of us did. I grew up in a hunting family, and many of the folks that I went to college with did as well. So there's a role there, right? Things have changed in that regard. There's more of a threat because of situations like Virginia Tech. And so we come to it with a little bit more fear, I think, right? That's a shame because so many of our students come from subsistence families and hunting families. And I think we've lost something in that regard because of that. So it saddens me, but as an administrator, I think we're making a good choice. It's a difficult choice, but it's one that saddens me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Title IX, and I would say sexual assault generally needs, that's the full community needs to be involved in that discussion. And I think the United States Department of Education is trying to use the universities to help grow change in society with regard to sexual assault. That's an interesting strategy in many respects, but I think it needs much broader attention from the community as a whole. I tried to take that approach, made some progress on it. I worked with Colonel Williams of Fort Wainwright and Karen Gaborik of the school district to try to broaden the conversation on that topic so that it really is more of a community-based conversation about sexual assault being something we all need to work on preventing, and having a regular open dialogue about it and what our expectations are in that regard. What is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior. Using alcohol as a weapon with regard to sexual assault. You know, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. We have a long ways to go. UAF still has challenges in that regard. Social media has played a significant role in the perception of the university. If you read Title IX very carefully, it's extremely difficult to address, and both from the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights regulations, but also the law. And so if you have a case where your police forward a case to the district attorney says there's not sufficient evidence to pursue the legal side, the university still must pursue the Title IX Student Code of Conduct sanction side, right? But it has to do so in a very restricted information sharing situation. If the district attorney chooses to pursue a case, the police investigation is entirely public then, okay? If they choose not to pursue a case, none of that information can be released, but the university must still pursue the Student Code of Conduct side. And so it becomes extremely challenging from a transparent, open communication style that universities prefer to have. And so it's a particularly difficult situation to put universities in. We weren't designed to be, to conduct investigations or hold court. That's what the judicial system is for, and yet the university is asked to play a role in both of those areas now. And so it's an added responsibility, and one that universities across the nation are still learning. So
I want to pull back and ask a sort of a broad brush canvas approach to education. It's here in Alaska, of course, over the years, we've tried to work with industry and target those positions, such as nursing, for example, that we could expand or create coursework that would serve that need. On the other hand, the academy comes from a tradition that you not only teach people, but you broaden them. You, in essence, make citizens as well as employees. So that sort of broad picture. It seems to me like the university's changing now, and there are more challenges. You mentioned social media and the internet and like the Khan Academy. All these new delivery systems and opportunities radically changing the way the academy does what it does. Do you mind reflecting a little bit on these changes and prognosticate at all what you see ahead?
Oh, seeing ahead, I'm not sure I'll go there, but I'm not much of a fortune
Extrapolate from the
not much
data.
of a fortune teller. So certainly technology is having a significant impact, right? The availability of information, the computing abilities, just changing higher education in many respects significantly. Information, you know, is like coming out of a fire hose now, as they say. Higher education needs to continue to focus on the basic parts of understanding, critical thinking, expanding the way people think and explore things, right? All of those. I do share a concern about higher education becoming focused on employment. I'm kind of a purist on the academic side. I often say higher education is about getting a life, not just a job, right? I don't remember who first said that. I can't take credit for that, but I generally agree with that sentiment. Students often will struggle at length over what major, right, they should pursue, right? And my perspective on that is, you know, the bachelor's degree is about learning how to think, right? Learning to stretch your imagination, to stretch the way that you approach problems, and not so much about the very specific field that you study, per se. Each of the fields has its own strengths and weaknesses in many respects in that regard, in the ability to stretch one's intellect, but they all do. And that really is what that first degree is about. And advanced degrees, masters and doctorates, are, let's say, greater focus, right? Greater depth in many regards. And again, they stretch you in new ways. Right? So there's a fun little story about a young man whose family was third or fourth generation of Iowa corn farmer. And he earns a degree, and the president of the university says, "You earned a degree in philosophy. What made you choose philosophy? Aren't you going to go back to the farm and take over the farm from your father? And if so, why philosophy?" And his response was, "Yes, I will be a farmer, and I hope my son will be a farmer. But we have to have something to think about while we're driving that combine." you know? And so really that's what it's about. So I do share that concern. I do believe higher education is changing. I see the kinds of degrees that are the fastest growing degrees at the university, and they're different than what you would expect. Some of the degrees programs that we've fiscally effectively been forced to eliminate that I would have not chosen to eliminate. You know, we have one that just passed the board, economics. That's just a shame, in my opinion. And sociology is being considered for elimination this fall. Two fundamental programs to a university, right? But their student-faculty ratio, hitting a very negative stride there. And other programs, things like emergency management, bachelor's degree in emergency management, growing like leaps and bounds. Very curious shifts that I would not have anticipated, but they're very real for us. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure higher education can or will change fast enough, and maybe it shouldn't. I struggle with that. The approach that and the traditions that we've had have served us well for centuries, but the world is changing quickly, and I'm not sure we're prepared well enough to change with it. So I worry for higher education in many regards because of that.
Yeah, I imagine. Well, you're just days away from setting aside your current responsibility. What's ahead for you?
I've accepted leadership of a smaller institution.
Oh.
Okay. A smaller group, less responsibilities. I was elected president of my hiking club. And
talk about unruly.
So I'm going to spend more time hiking with my wife and our friends, and then I'll snowbird between here and Arizona. My son, and you'll love the irony here, my son is a plumber pipe fitter. And good choice, Seth. And so he remains here in Alaska, so Kay and I will come back and visit our son regularly. And our friends we hope to see in the grocery stores and restaurants, and we'll occasionally stop by the university.
I can't let you go without explaining, in show business, you never appear on stage with animals or children because you'll get upstaged, and we've been upstaged by this poster. What is it?
So this was a gift from my brother, a very thoughtful gift. I know this is going to air on KUAC. It's the print of many polar bears wearing bow ties, and it's called the Class Act, or A Class Act. And it's a long-time poster of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. But if for those of you that are in the audience, you can see it closely. It has the signatures of all of the presidents from William Wood through Pat Gamble on it. And I started off as a student when Bill Wood was the president, and I served as vice president under Pat Gamble. And so my brother went to the trouble of getting all of those signatures and giving it to me as a gift the first time I retired. And so I thought I would bring it as a prop today. So my thanks to my brother for such a wonderful and thoughtful gift. So.
Well, our thanks to you for service. Now, before we give you a round of applause and send you off hiking, I do want to give an opportunity for the audience if you have some questions. I think we're fine if you just stand up and ask your question, but if not, I'll come with the microphone. And does anybody have any questions for Dana?
Yeah, Robert brought up the issue of the legislature and the attitude or knowledge or whatever has caused them to not have as much respect for the university, for science, for many of the things that in the past have been considered very important. And I wonder what advice you might give to the incoming chancellor, who is resident here, on how to address this lack of understanding of the role of the university, because the cutbacks that have happened over the last 3 years and have been debilitating, I think, changing the nature of the university, and must be reversed.
Well, a very difficult question. The university is targeted for budget cuts for fairly simple reasons, in my opinion. One is it's one of the 4 most expensive, or maybe not most expensive, it's one of the 4 greatest budget allocations of state general funds, right? And so being in the top 4, you're going to be the target of budget reductions when the state revenue is declining sharply. It's as simple as that in many respects. So the university is, and you'll hear legislators refer to it as a cost, right? And so we have to spend our time talking about the benefit, right? And the return on investment. Last year in particular, there was a large part of the legislative discussion was about maybe we should eliminate our funding of research. That's just shooting yourselves in the foot because the return on investment is amazingly positive there. So is the return on investment of the educational endeavor, of course, and the outreach endeavor, of course. All play a role, right? And so we have to spend more time talking about the benefits, just as simple as that. It is a very difficult conversation, reminding them of those that start new businesses, right? Those that become the physicians, the lawyers, the accountants, the local engineers that construct the bridges. The vast majority come out of these institutions, right? And we need them. And if they're not coming from here, then we're importing them and paying the price of turnover that occurs with that transient part of the population. It's ironic because the nursing program was funded on that argument, right? And in many respects, the engineering program was as well. But the broadness of the various educational programs that we offer, it's not accepted in the same general way, and I don't understand that. Because we're supplying citizens of every different possible ilk, if you will, right? And of course, a society needs that broad diversity of intellect.
Yeah, basic economic concepts, land, labor, and capital. They don't understand the university as intellectual capital that creates the future. S&P bond ratings, Alaska used to be AAA, and it's sinking away. Why? Because there doesn't seem to be any means to pay. So how can anyone loan money to the state?
Yeah.
Basics.
We need a basic revenue stream. And you know, during difficult times like this, I saw it in the 86, 87 period, and I saw it this time. Even internally within the university, folks will say, oh, why aren't you cutting them and not us, right? And that's not what it's about. It's about the state revenue stream. And all of the citizenship needs to be having the conversation with the legislature about the state revenue stream. That's the enemy here.
John?
Yes, well, first I'd like to second what Robert said, thanking you for your great service. This is really more a follow-up to your presentation on Friday, where you emphasize recruitment and retention. As you know, tuition dollars don't come close to paying the cost of going to school here.
That's right.
So if we add more students, we're actually adding more cost unless we don't add additional resources for them. So the question is that really a good thing? And let me just follow it by saying that in the last few years I've taught a handful of courses where many students wanted to get in that couldn't. And it wasn't because I said go away, it was because of the fire marshal saying this is basically can get. The other courses were closed as well. Sometimes they didn't have other options. So at least in some cases, they were extending the number of semesters they had to be at the university. So haven't we, at least in certain areas, bumped up to the ceiling on what we can handle in terms of student numbers here. Does improving enrollment actually make sense now?
I believe it does, John. So John Gimble, thank you very much for the question. A colleague from the math department, a lot of years together there, and a lot of good mentoring. Thank you for that, John. So UAF has significant capacity in a lot of its majors. So the challenge comes in attracting students that can help us fill that capacity without overwhelming, in particular, the lower division general education courses. So that's the conundrum. But there's a reasonable path there. We have articulation agreements with quite a number of community colleges out of state. Attracting those students in particular already have the general education courses in their background, but have found success at their community colleges and now want to pursue a baccalaureate. We have a deal for you, right? Because our tuition is lower than most of even your in-state tuition in your home state. And the university has somewhere between 20 to 30% capacity for additional students, particularly in upper division coursework. In some areas of our gen ed as well, but primarily within the majors and upper divisions. So that's a reasonable target area that can and should be pursued. And I think it's one that's serving the School of Management, which continues to grow. They have reached out and formed particular articulation agreements for their majors. And we need more of our deans to be doing that with those same institutions. They could piggyback, for instance, off what the School of Management has done. That served them well. Some of their programs are online, and that's made it so some of those folks haven't had to relocate. They just pursue those degrees online. You heard me mention emergency management. 16% of their student enrollment is out of state, for example, all online. So there's possibilities. That's not going to work for every major, we know that, but there is room for growth there. We're closing a residence hall this fall. First time we've done that in a long time because of enrollment. Clearly there's capacity for additional students when we're facing that, right? So, so when you talk about capacity and does tuition cover it, if we have to create new sections and hire additional faculty to teach, if we can do it with adjuncts, the cost is easily made up. If we do it for upper division for tenured or tenure track faculty, then you're absolutely right. Then the cost issue becomes a significant issue, right? But we do have quite a bit of capacity, and I think trying to grow enrollment and increase retention both will help us on the revenue side because of that, John. Just my own take.
I think we have time for one more question. Jeannie?
Danny, you know my love of university history, and I know your love of canoeing, and I'm wondering if that started in August of 1967. And what were your experiences on campus? Were you on campus during the flood?
I was not on campus during the flood. We lived in I was 14 going on 15 when the flood hit, okay? And our house was at 9th and Cushman. So I stood on the corner of 9th and Cushman and watched the water come down Cushman Street, quite literally, with my father. And then it kept rising, and it got so that we could just barely cross the street there in hip boots. And occasionally it would go over our hip boots crossing the street there at 9th and Cushman, just to give you some sense of the depth of the water there. I was all over the town and area in a riverboat during that flood, sometimes the propeller hitting the tops of vehicles that were underwater, which was entertaining in itself. I'm sure the owners didn't find it that way after the fact. But I recall boats, quite a collection, almost a marina at the base of the hill of the university, but I didn't come onto campus. Jeannie just gathered a bunch of information for me. Peter Van Noort of iHeartRadio interviewed me about my experiences on the flood and had a bunch of questions about the university's role in the flood. And Jeannie did all of the homework preparing me for that. One of my favorites is the university served 14,000 Frankfurters on August 16th, 1967 alone. Just that one day, 14,000 Frankfurters. So who can forget something like that? But something like 7,000 people came to the campus during that flood period. And the university fed them. It created its own dog yard because there were dogs. There were over, as I recall, something like 300 infants came with that crowd. And so we had all kinds of interesting issues as a university. And talk about other duties as assigned for faculty and staff. That was a remarkable piece of our history. And the university really stepped up. So very fun story. Thank you for gathering all that fun information.
Well, thank you, Dana Thomas, for your years of service and as a professor and administrator. Thank you.
No, thank you.